15.
Thank you. I always think it's rather like when you damn the best man by saying he's funny before he actually speaks, when you say he's impressive. I mean, you'll have to be the judge of that in 15 minutes' time. In the real world, when I'm not sort of moonlighting as a writer and being fantastically intimidated by finding myself in such illustrious company, I'm a lawyer. And I think, with respect to some of my fellow speakers, thanks to journalists and politicians, we're not quite the most despised profession in the country, but we're still pretty lowly regarded. And of course, the bad thing about lawyers, and especially barristers like myself, is that we love the sound of our own voice, and we get paid by the hour. So speaking for a very brief amount of time to a tight brief is an anathema to us. I'm going to try not to waffle too much. I'm going to try not to get distracted, but 15 minutes is going to be tough. What I am going to talk to you about, or really what I'm going to do, is I'm going to try and tell you a couple of stories. And they are stories from my latest book, which was mentioned. If you come to these sort of things regularly, or if you go to interesting lectures, I think you probably start to get the impression that everyone who ever speaks has got a book coming out. It's mostly because the publicists do all this work for us. But unfortunately, and I say unfortunately, it's quite topical as well. The book which I've just written, or which I've just finished, which is called Kandak, and Kandak is the Afghan word for a battalion. And I have to explain to you briefly why I wrote it, for it to make sense. I wrote a memoir when I left the army in 2009 called the Junior Officers Reading Club, and it was really kind of like any memoir written by someone in their mid-20s, incredibly self-indulgent. And it was just about what it was like being in the army 2004 to 2009, which is when I served in Iraq, Afghanistan, various places. But I don't know if you remember in 2009, media focus suddenly shone quite brightly on Afghanistan. There was Operation Panther's Claw that summer, which was the biggest operation the army had undertaken. Colonel Rupert Thornlow was killed. He was the first commanding officer of a battalion to be killed in action since Colonel H. Jones in the Falklands. Everything got quite political. There was quite a public debate about whether the armed forces were being adequately supported, whether there were enough helicopters, protected mobility. And suddenly, and as it happened just as I had this book come out, there was a lot of media attention. And I'll never forget this one thing. I found myself, I think because I was sort of slightly younger and a sort of slightly different face than the usual more crusty sort of armchair generals who commentate on military matters, I found myself kind of being asked to go on radio programs and news programs and comment or observe on something. And the tragedy of writing, as I effectively have done, about war and conflict is that if you're in demand, it's probably not for nice or good reasons. If it's topical, it's probably sad news. And as I say, it would be funny if it wasn't so dark, but this one probably well-intentioned, over-enthusiastic BBC researcher who was kind of leading me through the labyrinth of TV centre. And I'd gone in to talk about an incident in Sangin where 5 young riflemen had been killed in a single IED strike. Obviously incredibly difficult, incredibly somber, and I was sort of thinking, how do you reflect how difficult that is for a small unit and for the guys who survive, apart from anything else. And this guy said, oh, this must be fantastic for your book. So it's always difficult when something's topical. And the book that I've just done, unexpectedly and fortuitously, although not for good reasons, is topical, because it's effectively about the relationship between ISAF, the British, the American, the Canadian, the Australian, all those contributing nations in Afghanistan, and the Afghan National Security Forces they're working alongside. And obviously this is very much under focus at the moment because, as pretty much everybody in this room will now know, green on blues, as they're kind of wonderfully euphemistically referred to, are topic of the day in Afghanistan. And after this rather pleasant and joyful summer in which good news has been further up the agenda, we're back to bad news. I think, in fact, this morning there was a green on blue attack in a base in Berkhamsted in which somebody wearing an Afghan National Army uniform shot and injured a local civilian who he claimed afterwards he was aiming at an American serviceman. Of course, on Saturday, Sergeant Thursby and a Private Rowe were both killed by a man at their base wearing an Afghan local police uniform, pretending to be injured. They went to his assistance and he had a concealed weapon and he shot both of them. And obviously, the pertinent, the relevant, the crucial question is, why is this happening? If there's any credible exit strategy at all to what we're doing in Afghanistan, then it surely depends on the relationship between the Afghans and their international mentors, and this is a relationship which is clearly souring. And all I'm going to do, because if I've learned anything about Afghanistan in the very brief times I've been there and the brief time I've spent there, it's that it's far too complicated to try and understand, and that's usually where we go wrong. So all I'm going to do is tell you two stories from this second book, having explained to you why I wrote it. And one is the only time I ever had the Afghans that I lived and worked with and that I came to regard as friends and comrades, the only time they ever even faintly turned a weapon on me. And then I'm going to tell you another story which, for me, encapsulates the cultural differences between the two sides that are purportedly allies in this conflict. And the cultural differences are important because the narrative we hear when you read about these green-on-blue attacks, and the narrative that the insurgents, that the Taliban would love to be absolutely correct, although I suspect it's not, is that these are infiltration attacks. They are planned, they are a clear sign of an insurgency undermining what is going on. And of course, the natural reaction for anybody who has just turned his gun on his comrades and his allies and who's about to be shot by them or arrested is to flee to the group that he knows will protect him, and in this case, that is the Taliban. But what I suspect is far more common, and what we have not quite understood sufficiently, and I think we're trying to get there now, is that actually these incidents are far more a symptom not of an ideological plan or a deep-seated hatred between an individual who has wanted to do this for a long time. They are invariably the result of the situation that all these men find themselves in, which is a situation of incredible stress and tension because they're effectively on the front line in a war. And that tension is exacerbated by these cultural differences. And the reason why I wrote this second book was after the first one and after the sort of attention it had got because Afghanistan became topical, I think a lot of people thought of it as an Afghanistan book. And I came to think of it as an Afghanistan book, even though it was, had bits of Sandhurst and Iraq and even sort of in-jokes with my friends from university, which I tried to sneak past the editor. And when I went back to Afghanistan and I met the guys I had fought alongside, we had this incredible reunion down in a camp in southern Afghanistan. I hadn't expected to see them. I'd been visiting some friends in the British Army, and they'd said, "Do you realize the guys who are down here are your guys? They're the same guys you were with in 2007. And I'd spent 7 months working alongside these guys, so I felt close to them, and it was amazing. So I was brilliant. I went over to see them. And we had this evening, we sat in an ops room, and we were all sort of smoking and eating sort of rice and lamb, which is what we used to do. And I said to them really excitedly, well, they said to me, "Why are you not a soldier anymore? Why are you wearing pajamas? Why haven't you got a rifle? What's wrong with you? Are you a woman?" And I said, "Yeah, basically, I've become a writer. It's pretty much worse." And I got a lot of stick from them. Because there was a real sense of disappointment. I think there was a bond that we had formed because we had fought together, sometimes in quite difficult circumstances, and that bond had overcome the very significant differences between us. And I think they felt a sort of certain amount of betrayal. And I was trying to make it up to them. I think not deliberately, maliciously, I wasn't trying to mislead them, but in my mind, I was sort of trying to make it up to them. So I said, well, it's all right, because what I wrote is about you. No one in England ever talks about the Afghan National Army. You don't hear an Afghan voice, and that's still true today. We're fighting a conflict in Afghanistan. When do you ever hear a spokesman on the news from the Afghan National Army? When do you ever hear an Afghan soldier? It's always an ISAF spokesman or a British guy. And the vast majority of books are understandably, but they're all about this British unit, that British unit, this guy who won a medal. So I said, well, it's all right, I've written a book, and it's about us. And somebody had a copy of the book, and I took it through, and we started flicking through it. And the guys didn't speak English, they wanted to see the pictures. But it was abundantly clear, even to someone who doesn't read, let alone read English, that this book was not about them. It was about me, like everyone's first book is. Not about me, but and I sort of suddenly felt this overwhelming guilt. And I say it wasn't deliberately, I hadn't deliberately misled them. In my mind, it was an Afghanistan book, and they're a big part of that, but they weren't a big part of the book. So I wrote Kandak to try and put them front and center. And I was in a very privileged position because I wasn't a soldier, but I wasn't a journalist, but I had the trust of a number of guys because we'd fought together, so I was able to go down there, conduct these long interviews with them, and try and get a sense of what they felt was going on. And it was in that process that I realized how big the cultural difference was. And if there is any sort of coherent theme in the second book, it's about, is this cultural gap too big And if not, how on earth can it be overcome? And can it only be overcome by fighting together, which is how we did it? And I'll give you just a couple of examples of how subtle and murky these cultural tensions can be, because there's the obvious rough guide, don't wear your boots in someone's house, because we know that was once offensive. And that was something when we first went to Afghanistan, everything would take 10 minutes longer, because we'd walk over to their camp and we'd all start undoing our massive boots, and then we'd have to put them on again at the end, until one of them said, look, we don't care. We're living in the field. Everywhere's a mud hole. You don't have to take your boots off. It's really sweet. We know someone's told you we find that offensive. We don't. Just get on with it. A really good example, there was a very big study done by the Americans. You can say whatever else you want about the Americans, and I'm a hopeless Americophile, but they look at what they do wrong so carefully compared to all the other allies, and they try and amend it, and they realize this cultural tension thing was becoming a problem. They did this huge study last year into what the differences are. They then tried to suppress the study, which is possibly not so ideal, because it revealed such a gulf between the allies. But dogs, I'll take the example of dogs. One of the top complaints of Afghan soldiers about their ISAF counterparts was that we mistreat dogs. And this was based on a couple of incidents where, going out on patrols, the Taliban will tend to use dogs as a recce screen. So big dog 500 meters away, medium dog 250 meters away, little dog right by the position. And depending on the bark, you know how close the enemy are. And that did lead to sort of regrettable but military expedient incidents of dogs being shot on patrol. And it's not nice and no one wants to do it, but neither do you want to have your patrol of 8 guys killed in an IED strike. And the Afghans had reported this a number of times. It's clearly a real sticking point. When American troops were asked what one of the things that most annoyed them about Afghan soldiers, they said how they treat dogs. Because American and British soldiers will tend to adopt stray dogs and have them on base and pet them. And unfortunately, there are a number of instances of Afghans basically torturing stray dogs. Now, how on earth have we arrived at this point where the complaint by either side is exactly the same, how you treat dogs? Well, it turns out that the nuance, which isn't being appreciated, is that the Afghans objected to the shooting of dogs in compounds because they were someone's property, and you were defining a property right. They didn't regard the strays as anyone's property, and therefore you could treat them as you wanted. Well, of course, the Americans and Brits regarded a dog as a dog, and were all quite sentimental about animals. So that's just one example of how complex the distinction can be. And I didn't come with any massive conclusions, but as I say, I'll give you these 2 stories. One is the only time I ever had an Afghan weapon turned on me, and that's an example of how we do things differently. And then the other one, I think, just sums it all up quite nicely. It was 2007, and it was the first major operation that I ever did with my Afghan counterparts. I was in charge of a team of about 12 Brits, quite experienced, quite well equipped, quite well trained, because we were doing this specific job. And in theory, we were partnered with, but effectively were leading/guiding about 110 Afghans. And this operation was also the first operation where an Afghan unit was being trusted, in inverted commas, to take a discrete part of the operation. We were basically one channel that had to be cleared, with a British channel to right and a British channel to left. And this was seen as a great example of trust, because normally the Afghans would have been kept in the rear. We went into a compound, and I realized I was on my own. And in the compound, we thought there were some weapons being hidden, and the Afghan commander had been smacking about a 16-year-old kid around the head with the back of his pistol. The kid was on the floor. His wife was screaming in the corner. And I'm instantly having that moment, Michael J. Fox in Casualties of War. I'm about to witness a war crime. I'm probably going to be implicated. Everything I've taught this guy about not doing this sort of thing is not worked. And I tried to think, how can I stop him doing this? I started saying, you're a warrior, and a warrior would not threaten an unarmed civilian. He cocked his pistol. I thought he was going to shoot him. This is going to be terrible. The minute he cocked his pistol, his mother stopped crying, said, I can't be bothered. They're hidden over there. And we found about 14 AK-47s in the space of 10 minutes. And this guy just clapped me on the shoulder, 45-year-old veteran of all the wars in Afghanistan. He said, you're so sweet and well-intentioned, but how are we ever going to get this done if we follow your ridiculous rules? Now, that's one example. The other example, who was right, who was wrong, I still don't know. The other example, which sums up the whole thing, how different we can be. And this was when I was back out there in 2009, writing and sort of trying to gather this material. And I was walking across from where I was sleeping in the British base, and I saw all the guys outside the main tent. And that's usually a bad sign. If everyone's outside having a talk, has there been a casualty or something? But there hadn't. They were all looking up at the sky. And there was this amazing, I've never seen it before or since, there was a cloud formation that basically meant the moon had been refracted in a ring that was sort of projecting down. It was absolutely extraordinary. We all tried to get photos of it, but they wouldn't come out. And that night, there was a massive threat alert. It was Christmas Eve, and the Taliban were going to attack all our positions because they don't like Christmas. And so there was heightened security everywhere. Now, I went around to the Afghan side to say, what's going on with the heightened security, and what's this ring in the sky? And there were no Afghans to be seen anywhere. They were all huddled in the ops room. And I said, is this because of the threat warning? Are we all nervous? They're like, no, there will be no attacks tonight. I said, no, there's definitely going to be attacks tonight. We know the Taliban are going to attack tonight for Christmas Eve. No, definitely no attacks tonight. Turns out that the ring formation in the sky, according to an old Pashto wives' tale, means that if you cross the line on the ground, you change sex. Absolutely. All cultures have a myth where men turn into women and back. This is absolutely true. Not a single Afghan, Taliban or otherwise, was going out of their hut that night. If you think about it, if you're Taliban, you really don't want to turn into a woman because specifically, you're going to have to beat yourself regularly. But of course, there were no attacks that night. The British thought there were no attacks because we'd heightened security. The Afghans knew there were no attacks because they thought they were going to change into women. Again, who was wrong, who was right, I don't know. Those are two very small examples of a massive problem which I can't hope to even begin to answer, but maybe we should all think a little more deeply about it, and that will help get towards an approximation of a solution. Thank you very much.